And we're supposed to be out of here around 1 o'clock, so afterwards, you know, if you want to speak to our speaker afterwards, try to be quick or take it outside so that we can vacate the room. And also our speakers are told that this runs until 1 o'clock and they want to get out of here oftentimes as quickly as possible after 1 o'clock. So also remember to turn off your cell phones, and I'll leave it to Robert to introduce people.
All right, thanks for part of the housekeeping, Chuck. Just one other thing before I forget. Only members of the press club and work the media can ask questions of our guest today. Our guest today is Mr. Stephen Street. He's the Inspector General for the state of Louisiana. Has held that role since 2008. His office is tasked with rooting out corruption, waste, and fraud in Louisiana government, so he's obviously a very busy man in this state. So he is here today to talk about his office as well as his successes, and a recent legislative effort, which I believe was just killed, to try to get rid of funding for his office, which has happened more than once. So without further ado, Mr. Stephen Street.
Thank you for having me, guys. I'm glad to be here today. It's almost like Groundhog Day for some of you. It seems that the only time I come to Press Club is after the legislature tries to shut the office down. And I would say that as an Inspector General now for 8 years, and someone who has spent my entire career in the criminal justice system, I have now learned that if you do this job right, that there will be folks that are going to come after you, and that it's going to happen regularly. This is actually the second time, so I'm going to back up to 2012. The last time I actually spoke at the Press Club was in 2012, after we had been pulled completely out of the state budget through an Appropriations Committee amendment that I had no advance warning about. And the interesting thing that time was that by the time we were able to get our feet up under us, it had already cleared the House, and we had to spend several weeks here in Louisiana getting all the bad publicity that comes from the classic man bites dog story, and that is Louisiana politicians trying to close down what is a highly effective public corruption agency. Now in 2012 we were able to get that money restored through the Senate, but it took several weeks. This time I'm very pleased to report that last Thursday the Inspector General was restored to the House Budget Bill by acclamation. That means that the entire House of Representatives by acclamation agreed that we should be back in there. Now we're still at a 20% cut along with a lot of other state agencies, and that is in our opinion not acceptable either, but we do understand the reality of the budget situation, and we hope to have an opportunity to discuss that stuff in the Senate. But suffice it to say, and for those of you who weren't around in 2012 during this last fight, I was told when I first took this job by, at the time, Bob Sarasoli, who was the New Orleans Inspector General, he said, "Steve, if you do this job right, they will try to shut you down." Now back then, I didn't know what he meant. I learned that firsthand in 2012. Well, here we are 4 years later, almost like the Olympics or the World Cup. You know, there's got to be some effort to shut the Inspector General's office down. And I think what happened this time is you had the bad budget situation, which, as you guys know, is very real. I think some folks saw an opportunity there to be able to back us out of the budget and perhaps not catch the level of criticism that they otherwise might have to endure. I'm pleased to say that this time I had a little bit of advance warning. I knew it was coming, and so we were able to sort of marshal the resources that are available to support inspectors general. And by that I mean citizens groups, ordinary citizens who are sick and tired of corruption in this state. And the fact is that we have made a lot of progress in the last decade. If you could really, the line in the sand as I view it was Katrina. That's the time when the folks in Louisiana decided that public corruption jokes were no longer funny. That is the moment in time where people decided enough is enough. And I think you've seen over the last 11 years, or almost 11 years, a decreasing tolerance among average citizens for public corruption. And so you've had quite a few of the very high-profile public corruption cases where public officials have gone to prison, where other sometimes prominent citizens have gone off to jail for essentially stealing from the taxpayers. There's very low tolerance for it now. And I think what you saw last week was, obviously the House Appropriations Committee pulled us out of the budget, but I believe between Monday and Thursday there was such an outcry that by the time it came around, again, to have it put back in by acclamation was really very personally gratifying to me, because I think it recognized the value of our office. And so what I want to do, there's a number of things that I want to discuss, and I know I've got limited time, but let me start by saying this. This is now the second time that the Inspector General's funding has been pulled completely out of the House budget bill since I became the IG. Now, you guys will remember that the office is almost 30 years old, I guess, or it's for 1988, do the math. It was the first IG was Bill Lynch, as you guys will remember, and then Sharon Robinson took it for a couple of years, and then I came in 2008, and the office was made statutory. And there were a lot of statutory measures put in place that make us unique in state government, and that we are independent, truly independent. The IG has a 6-year term, during which he cannot be removed without a majority vote of both the House and Senate and the governor's signature. Why is that important? Well, that 6-year term overlaps the governor. It's to keep it non-political. And I guess that would be the message that I would send, is that we are the only independent, non-political watchdog that's out there that represents the people and no one else. And that's the message that we've been trying to get out. And I can talk about our successes, our productivity, and those things, and I'm going to do that in just a second. But what I wanted, the message for today, since we're back in the budget, I'm so glad that sanity prevailed and that we were put back in by acclamation. We're still going to watch that process, and a lot of people are going to watch that process, and we're very hopeful that we won't have any more issues for some time. But I believe it's now time to start considering protected funding for the State Inspector General's office, and not just discussing it, but actually pushing it as a legislative initiative. I think we now have 2 examples of this occurring. And let me say this, I am fortunate enough to have been elected president of the National Association of Inspectors General, and in that capacity I've had the opportunity to get to know IGs from all over the country. I've also gotten to travel quite a bit. These fights over Inspector General authority and funding and those things, they happen everywhere where IGs are, with the exception of, say, a state like Florida, where you've got the IGs are sort of built into state government. Every state agency has one, and you have a chief IG. But even there, the IG's constantly embroiled in controversy. And by that, I told the Appropriations Committee the other day, we are set up to handle the toxic cases that most other public officials will shy away from. And by toxic, I mean, I'm repeating what I told to the face of the members of the Appropriations Committee. Toxic means the cases that are guaranteed to infuriate the folks at the Capitol, and in particular the ones on the budget committees that are going to, and that's just the nature of what we do. We wade into those cases where the politics are already very toxic and very hot and heavy, and our job, as I see it, is to get to the truth and measure it against the law, without regard to who it's going to anger, without regard to any political agenda, without regard to partisan politics in any way, shape, or form. That's the only way an office like ours can be trusted. And what is the other major independence measure? The IG is not allowed legally to run for public office. That's huge in terms of being able to give confidence to the public that what we do is not backed by some motivation to get to the next level or the next step. In fact, from the day I would walk away from the IG's office or no longer be the IG, I have to wait 4 full years before I can legally qualify to run for public office. And as you guys know, 4 years is an eternity. It's long enough to give the public confidence that our investigations are not motivated politically or motivated by politics. And that's not to say that there's been a lot of discussion about the other offices like the Attorney General and the Legislative Auditor. All of those agencies have very vital roles and broad responsibilities in state government. We would never in any way suggest that those agencies do not play a vital role in government. And as a matter of fact, we've worked in partnership with all of them. But it's important to note the fundamental differences between the Inspector General and, say, the Attorney General or the Legislative Auditor. And you guys have on, at your table, there's some very short bullet points there that will describe for you the major differences. But, the the independence measures that are set up, they allow us to pursue these cases without regard to the politics. And I'll tell you, in this business, you better have those protections because you've already seen what's happened. I've got the protections, and they've still come after us twice to try to completely defund the office. And so it's time to not only discuss protected funding for the Inspector General, but to try to do something about it, and that is very much what I intend to do. So let me go ahead and address a couple of key issues. The first of all, is the Inspector General productive? Is it a productive public corruption agency? That's a fair question, and it's one that I think has a very clear answer of yes. And let's start with the last 4 years of our federal prosecutions, and that is Inspector General investigations that resulted ultimately in federal indictments by United States Attorney's offices. Since 2012, we've had 24 of those. 23 of them resulted in felony convictions. That's 20 guilty pleas, 3 that were found guilty by a criminal jury, and 1 that was found not guilty. That's a 96% success rate on federal criminal prosecutions. Now, as I spoke to the Appropriations Committee, I pointed out 7 of those cases involved fraud against Louisiana's film tax credit program. And that's important. That program's been in the news a lot. And it's not just the film tax credit program. There's also historic preservation tax credits and any number of different tax credits. And those are going to be in the public discussion for quite some time. But we had 7 successful cases involving fraud against that program, where 7 individuals were convicted of various felony offenses under the United States Code. Out of those 7 cases, you had a fraud amount of nearly $10 million. $4.5 million of that were in fraudulent payments that we were able to get in the way of. In other words, we were able to go inside Economic Development, Department of Revenue, Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, the Lieutenant Governor's Office, and to tell these people, look, this is fraud, and I can promise you that you don't want to pay this. You don't want the headline to be, after these folks get indicted, that we paid them $4.5 million that they weren't entitled to. And so that's real money. And you compare that to, say, a $1.9 million appropriation, that's on an annual basis. And that's just a slice of the work that we've been doing on the criminal side. We also have done quite a bit in terms of wasted funds, and I know that's an issue that several of you here are passionate about, and many of the citizens in government are very passionate about. I'll point back a couple of years to a report that we did concerning waste after Hurricane Isaac. And that was, we identified $15 million that had been wasted on ice that was allowed to melt in an unrefrigerated warehouse. That report is available on our website, but essentially what happened was that all of this ice was put in an unrefrigerated warehouse. It never made it to the public, and we were able to figure out that the ice that did make it to the public ended up costing $28 for every 10-pound bag. And that's the kind of stuff that we got a lot of attention over that report because it infuriated people, and it should. Those are the kind of things, and we are unique in that sense. The Attorney General doesn't investigate waste. There's not any, the auditor sometimes will do that, but the auditor's not law enforcement. We are. And so in fact, many of you this morning may have received a press release. I promise you this is total coincidence. We've had an arrest warrant in the system now for nearly a month, and for a little bit more than a month. And a lady was arrested this morning on one of our investigations over at Veterans Affairs. And that essentially was a Veterans Affairs nurse in Reserve, Louisiana, that falsified records in the wake of a patient's death. And you guys will be able to read about that. But that's just the latest development concerning investigation at Veterans Affairs. We released a joint report on February 1st with the auditor, pointing out a lot of problems with that department. And then we had an arrest last fall of a director of a home in Jackson, Louisiana, for destroying records of incident reports with patients. And now this is the latest, where you actually had somebody that a patient fell. There were supposed to be urological checks done. They didn't do it. The patient died, was discovered dead in his room the next morning. And this nurse entered a bunch of false records to make it look like she had been doing these checks. And so she was arrested this morning on an Inspector General's warrant obtained by the Inspector General's office. So we investigate all sorts of misconduct, corruption, waste. fraud, and we have focused, because of the law enforcement designation, we focused a lot on making good, solid criminal cases, because we think that's where the biggest bang is for the taxpayer dollar in terms of deterrent effect. Because you can put a report out and people can get bad publicity, and then the next news cycle comes and you don't know whether anything necessarily will happen in terms of positive developments and change and that sort of thing. So we try to make those criminal cases. We can't make them every time, but as I think the numbers, especially on the federal side, will show you that we've had a lot of great success. And we also have done a number of state prosecutions, and those are, at the numbers on those right now, we've got 19 of those that have been brought. 10 of them have resulted in convictions, and 9 remain pending. This will probably, the arrest that occurred this morning will be another one that's remaining pending. But none of those have been resolved, but in terms of an acquittal or dismissal yet. Now there's one that's likely going to be a dismissal, but we feel good about our numbers there. And then there's another document. Okay, one of the things that, and this is really probably one of the key things to remember, it's in the documents that are on the table there. We are required to report our average of fraud and corruption identified. It's in the state, what they call the La Paz system. That's one of our performance indicators. So we have to report the 3-year average. But if you look at that document which says fraud and corruption identified compared to OIG budget, over a 5-year period, we identified almost $34 million. And during that same time frame, we're appropriated a little less than $9 million. Okay, now where I come from, those are pretty doggone good numbers. That's roughly 4 to 1, not quite 4 to 1, a little less than 4 to 1. If you go to the 3-year average, it's over 5 to 1. And we've actually had, the 2-year average is 7 to 1. The bottom line is our office is paying for itself many times over. So why is it that Louisiana politicians want to shut down the Inspector General's office? What is it that we could possibly be doing that could anger them at that level, or at least some of them? And I want to give full credit to the House for restoring us. It was the right move. It was something that I think will spare our state quite a bit of embarrassment over the long haul. I've actually, again, in my travels, I've come to know that Louisiana still has a reputation, whether it's fair or not, of being a place where public corruption is not only tolerated, but in some circles, maybe even celebrated with a wink and a nod. I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's true anymore. But every time you have a story like this come up, it reinforces the worst stereotypes about the state, and it allows the folks who are predisposed to think bad things about Louisiana, gives them ammunition. It's not a smart move, and it's a disservice to the taxpayers to attempt this. So one of the other things to remember is that our statute, the Inspector General statute, has a funding mandate. It says the Louisiana legislature shall, the word shall is used, make adequate appropriations to the office to allow it to efficiently and effectively carry out its mission. That hasn't stopped this from happening. So we need protected funding, and we need to do it in a way that protects the legacy of the office going forward, because this is not about Stevens Street. It's never been about Stevens Street. I'm just the person who holds the title now. There will be someone else, and it's critical for the taxpayers that this office be allowed to continue. Let me tell you, these attacks on our funding have had a very debilitating effect on our ability to fulfill our statutory mission. And I'll tell you this, since on January 31st, we have 16 positions. An Inspector General, an attorney, an admin assistant who kind of runs the day-to-day operations, and everybody else is investigative field personnel. On January 31st, we were fully staffed. Since that time, I've lost 3 employees, including veteran criminal investigators who are not able to withstand the budget instability. It's a problem. It has caused harm to our office in terms of our ability to attract and to retain the type of the qualified individuals that have the combination of skills necessary to work the complex cases that we routinely work. We work in partnership with the FBI and with the United States attorneys. A lot of these cases are extremely complex and labor intensive. They take sometimes the latest film tax credit case that resulted in convictions in New Orleans took 2 years from the date we opened our file to the date that the jury said guilty. Okay, now that's not necessarily a typical result, but it does require a lot of skilled, experienced investigators to be able to do this job. And it's become a major problem. If I can't represent to people that we're not going to get shut down, it's a problem. And so the Inspector General's office, it's time to address protected funding. And I'm hoping that in future legislative session, perhaps in the next one, that we'll be able to get something out there, an instrument to be considered. I think it's important for the future of the office. And there are, we could kind of go on and on about the nature of our office, how it naturally swims upstream against politics. It's just, it goes without saying that, in fact, there's a saying in the Inspector General's office, if you're not getting sued, you're not working. Well, we've been sued 3 times in 8 years. I think that's probably a reasonable ratio for a lot of IG's offices. But, sometimes that's going to happen because you get out there and you do the work, you do it aggressively and without regard to who people's friends are, and sometimes that results in that sort of blowback. But, let's see what time. We still have a little bit more time. I want to make sure that we can continue on, and at some point we'll open it up for questions. I know that. Let me kind of move forward to the uniqueness of our office in state government. Again, this is the type of thing that this argument about redundancy has been raised all over the country. Sometimes it's a legitimate concern. Sometimes it's a subterfuge for those who want to try to shut down the office for other reasons. And that's the kind of thing that you want to try to avoid. Again, salary protection, the 6-year term which overlaps the governor. I'm not a John Bell Edwards appointee. I think you guys that are in the room probably know this. The office was set up that way on purpose to overlap the governor to keep it non-political. And so really we are unique in that sense. And our statute is actually viewed as one of the stronger IG statutes in the country with the soft underbelly of the office's funding. And this will happen again. It might take a couple of years because right now it's actually in the public eye, and it might be a while before someone tries it again, but it will happen again because I don't intend to stop doing the job. And we're going to stay aggressive, and we're going to stay in that pocket where we're pursuing the truth and going to measure it against the law. And whatever the result is, it is. That opens me up for criticism on all fronts. So I get criticized or sued when we arrest somebody. Sometimes I get criticized, and sometimes it seems more often I might get criticized for not arresting someone or seeking an arrest warrant or seeking criminal charges for someone. That's just the nature of the business. We go where the evidence takes us, and we're in the, as I've said before, we're in the evidence business. The evidence business means that what you know and what you can prove are 2 different things. And in the world in which we function, what we can prove is really all that matters. And that's just, I come from the world of being a prosecutor. I also have a person on my staff who was a prosecutor. And that allows us to sort of filter the cases. One of the things that I won't do is to send a case to a prosecutor that I wouldn't be proud to stand in front of a jury and try myself. If I know there's a case that's got flaws in it, because I used to be a white-collar prosecutor, I know what it means to stand in front of a jury and try to make them understand, what oftentimes can be a complex case. It can be a challenge. One of the things that I had to do as a prosecutor in many ways, and still tasked with doing as the Inspector General, is to take the complex and to make it simple. And that means make it to where the average person on the street who has no involvement in the criminal justice system or really in government circles, that they can still understand it. And I'll give you a quick anecdote and then we can move on to questions. I used to try money laundering cases, for example. That's a good one. The money laundering statute got a lot of legalese in it. It's very challenging to understand. Even lawyers who are in the business sometimes would have to read it 2 or 3 times to understand. So what I had to do was to take that money laundering statute. I would read it to 12 ordinary men and women sitting in the jury box, and I would say, okay, who of you just understood a word that I just said? And they'd be looking at me a little sheepishly, and I'd say, oh, it's okay, raise your hand if you didn't understand it, because you know what? I'm a lawyer that's been doing this a long time, and I sometimes have trouble getting my mind around it. So now, how many of you, let's put it a little bit more simply, how many of you understand what it means to steal something that doesn't belong to you? You know, and of course, everybody in the box raises their hand. How many of you understand what it means to tell a lie in order to cover up the fact that you stole something that did not belong to you? Ding, light bulb goes on. That's money laundering. Okay, so that's the challenge. What we try to do is to find the people that are lying, cheating, and stealing from the taxpayers and do our best to put them in jail if we can. If the evidence isn't there, to do what we have to expose it publicly, to get in the middle of the system and make recommendations that can hopefully put a stop to some of this. But it makes no sense at all to pull the plug out of the bottom of the boat. The IG's office is like that $10 plug that goes in the bottom of a fishing boat. You take the plug, you can save the $10, but you're going to have damage that's going to go way beyond that very, very quickly. So, again, it's not about me personally, it's not about Stephen Street, it's about the people of the office that I think plays a vital role in government. I'm very pleased that the money's been restored, but I think that I owe it to the office and to the public to do what I can to see to it that this doesn't happen again. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
You said that you would put people in jail, but what about the money? Do you get the money back?
Well, and as I was able to give you a couple of examples where we have gotten the money, what we do when we pursue. Oh, I apologize. I forgot one of the rules. The question was that you said you put people in jail, but what about the money? What do you do to get the money back? That's a good question, and it gets asked quite often. In the criminal prosecution realm, we function through the world of criminal restitution orders. So, for example, several of the cases that are in your handout were when those people pled guilty, the judge ordered them upon release to pay restitution back to the state of Louisiana. Now, as a practical matter, we may not get that money. Sometimes, especially with people who are engaged in criminal conduct, they may not have the money, and it may be difficult to get it back. I view it this way: if you plug up the hole, you're going to get that money back over time. Sometimes we can get it back by preventing it from going out the door, like we did in the 7 Arch case, the $4.5 million that we kept from going out the door. But it isn't that. I get that question all the time. Do you collect money? Well, no, we're not in a position to collect money. We're in a position to prevent it from going out. We're in a position to, in a criminal setting, get a judge to order somebody to pay it back, which has the same effect as a civil judgment. And depending on, for instance, the big report on waste with the melted ice that I talked about, after that report came out, there were changes made in the system so that won't happen again. And we feel comfortable that there's a process in place now to prevent that from happening again. I guess that'll only be determined for real when it's tested by the next disaster or crisis. But that's an excellent question, sir, about money. I'll tell you, I got several hands. I'll point to the lady there, and then I've got you and you next.
So you talked, I understand structurally the differences between your office, the AG, the legislative auditor, but in terms of what you investigate, is there anything that your office can investigate that the legislative auditor or the AG's office is barred from?
Well, I don't think there's, the Attorney General's got very broad investigative powers. I apologize once again. The question was, is there anything that the Attorney General or the legislative auditor is barred from investigating that only the IG can investigate? And I think the short answer is probably no. But I would say if you compare, the IG has its own unique niche in that way. Number one, the IG is not set up to investigate waste. They don't do it. And I say that as a person who worked at the Attorney General for 8 years and ran their insurance fraud unit. That they're not even set up with the auditors and the type of things that they need to investigate waste. Now, the auditor can investigate waste, but does not have law enforcement powers. So, and why does that matter? Law enforcement powers can be important when it comes to quickly getting information, and I'll back up to 2010, where United States of America versus Randy Zenna. That's a case where an attorney stole a bunch of money from a retirement system, from a police retirement system. The legislative auditor knew there was missing money, but they had been fighting with Mr. Zenna for quite a long time, trying to get records to prove what they believed was possible theft or misuse of funds. When the IG showed up, we were able to, under our statutory authority, get a search warrant, criminal search warrant, and we got that information immediately. Once the warrant was issued, we were able to show up at his office and just take the stuff. And then within a couple of weeks, we had a criminal case made. And so when you measure the IG's office against any particular state agency, there will always be some overlap, but there are critical differences in mainly the independence and the statutory protections and safeguards that we have that no other state agency has. So I had this gentleman in the back, and then you will be next.
You mentioned lawsuits as an effective means of determining that you were doing a good job. Two of those three lawsuits would be Corey Delahousse and Murphy Painter. In the Delahousse matter, Judge Riggs clearly established that the Inspector General did not follow any of the proper procedures that were required to legally gain the evidence that it had, and she suppressed all of it, and the charges were all dismissed. In the Murphy Painter situation, two of the counts in the indictment involved mailing sympathy cards to associates of his. Judge Brady even openly asked, this rises to the level of a federal offense. You were put on the witness stand in the Murphy Painter trial, and you said you had no knowledge of this particular investigation, and we need to talk to the investigator. Shane Evans, who was the investigator, was put on the stand, and he said he did nothing more than write down what Brant Thompson had told him regarding Mr. Painter being several characteristics he used to describe Mr. Painter that Brant Thompson did. But Shane Evans readily admit that's all he did was write it down. What is your argument to some very prominent attorneys that have said that your office really shouldn't have law enforcement ability, and you've demonstrated that by not following the proper procedures and not performing thorough investigative techniques and proceeding on to trial?
Okay, I was going to say, am I able to repeat that question? And is there even a question there? Let me just say this.
What do you say to those attorneys?
I do recognize you, Mr. Burns, and I'm thankful that you brought that question up, because these kinds of questions actually make my case for me. But let me just go forward, and I'll tell you a couple of key facts that Mr. Burns apparently didn't feel were important enough to bring up. In a companion civil case in the federal court in that matter, that individual, whose name I will not mention, was found to be 100% at fault by a federal civil jury. Let me repeat that, 100% at fault in that matter, factually, 100% at fault, and was awarded exactly $0.00 for the, so I'm willing to let that verdict stand for itself. With regard to the indictment that you mentioned, the United States Department of Justice thought enough of the Inspector General's proof in that matter to seek and obtain a 42-count felony indictment. And those of you who are familiar with the federal court process know that those things don't just drop out of the sky. Again, I am willing to accept both the result and the process in that case, and to defend 100% what our office did. I will correct the record, though, on the other matter that you brought up, which is there is no finding that has the effect of law that the Inspector General did anything illegally in any case. Our search warrant authority has been recognized by all judges in the 19th Judicial District Court, including some of the exact same arguments that were made in the case that you mentioned. 19th JDC judges have ruled the exact opposite of those, and the First Circuit actually reversed the judge in that particular case. So that's really all I have to say about that. As I'm sure Mr. Burns knows, there's pending litigation, so I'm not really able to discuss the facts of those cases, other than to say that we stand without reservation behind everything that we did. And the fact that we have folks that were charged with crimes as a result of Inspector General investigations that now want to see the office shut down really makes my case for me. Yes, sir.
I think you forcefully laid out your case to separate the different Inspector General. Accountants focus on dollars or numbers, but we economists think slightly different. If you have a 18-wheeler of apples, and then you break them into cases, and then a single apple, you could say I want just one apple, but it's still the same function. You had to break it down, cut out the middleman. In your case, if you moved your employees over to Inspector General, it doesn't, I mean, over to Internal Auditor, you would still have the same employees over there, but maybe not find you the $34 million. But that would bring your cost to zero. So the amount of return that you've got would be infinitum if you said these were the same salaries that we paid. Secondly, the accountant focuses on numbers, but in the real world, a lot of times it has to do with keeping honest people honest. So the lock on my shed that's never been tempted.
I'm sorry, you know, we're making speeches here.
I'm sorry.
Ask a question, please.
My
Part of the rules of the club, ask a question, he'll answer.
My question is it not possible that your office has saved way more than just the accounting dollar that you announced?
That's an excellent question.
Much larger impact.
Right, I think, and this is important, and there's a footnote actually at the bottom of one of the attachments there that says that the totals do not include what they call PELP, which is projected economic loss prevented. And that is a formula that the Federal Bureau of Investigation uses nationwide to estimate the preventive effects of its investigations. We do not calculate those totals, but if we did so, the amount would be far higher than $34 million over the 5-year period. So the preventive effect it's difficult to quantify, but again, I'm willing to use a formula that the Bureau has used in the past. One of the reasons we haven't done it is because we're trying to stick with the hard data when we go down to the legislature. It's important to be able to stick with them and give them, you know, hard numbers. And so sometimes it's difficult to projected economic loss prevented. It's hard to explain, but that's used by inspectors general's offices all over the country, and certainly our numbers would be even higher. But even at the numbers where we are, it's still a huge return on investment. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit about the Burl Kane report in light of the advocate's continued investigation in that? And as a follow-up, are you investigating Nate Kane and Department of Corrections?
Okay, the question was, can I talk about the Burl Kane report that I guess that was issued back in March, and there was a specific question about whether we're investigating Nate Kane.
And I'm sorry, specifically in light of the fact that one of your investigators has disavowed his name being included in the report.
Okay, and so the last part of the question was, I'm trying to repeat the question so everybody can hear. Burl Kane, Nate Kane, and my former investigator. Okay, the first question is that it's important to understand that the report that we issued was looking through the lens strictly of whether or not there were criminal charges that could be brought against Warden Kane. We concluded no. We gave an explanation of why. I'm not going to comment beyond that part. We're in the evidence business. The evidence did not support criminal charges in that matter. With regard to the second question, I'm not able to comment on specific cases that may or may not be ongoing. There's an IG confidentiality provision in statute that prevents me from doing that. And the third question, I guess about, I'll just repeat what I said to the advocate at the time, which was that that letter was prepared based on information gathered by the investigative team. And I stand fully behind every word of it, and don't really have any further comment. Yes, sir.
Looking at the case of the LPN that you're prosecuting and the previously DCFS employee, with budget cuts affecting your offices but other places much more heavily, do you expect the defense to be the system made me do it because, and that has been articulated by the attorney for the DCFS employee. Do you feel that that will have any resonance with juries? As a prosecutor, the papers are filled with discussion of budget.
Well, and that is true. The question was, in the context of this morning's arrest of a Veterans Affairs nurse and the previous arrest of a DCFS caseworker that falsified in-home visit records, do we expect possibly the arguments to be made that the bad budget made us do it, that unreasonable expectations were put on these employees? And that argument could very well be raised. I don't want to speculate for the, as to what the attorneys for those individuals would do. I can tell you that as a factual matter, that is not a legal defense to filing false records. And in particular, you've got now one case involved the death of a veteran's, an old veteran patient and the records were falsified in the wake of his death. The other one is involved false in-home visits in foster care. Now, the question there is, should we wait until a child dies or is horribly abused before we point out and say, no, that's not right? If you've got budget problems, do what you can at the legislature to address them, but it does not give one license to commit a crime. Yes, sir.
Do you feel that there was one case or investigation in particular that led to the House trying to remove funding?
Well, the question was, is there one case in particular that led the House committee members to try to remove funding for the IG's office? I would submit to you that as IG, that's a very difficult question to answer because we've worked enough of those kinds of cases to where I can't tell you. I think it's a combination of a lot of different cases that we've worked that have definitely angered people in government circles. There's really nothing I can do about that. The whole reason the office is set up the way it is because even the legislature that voted for the statute back in 2008 knew that I would be under duress if we did the job right, that we would have those kinds of attacks. So the short answer is no, I don't know of one specific case. I think it's a combination of many different sort of controversial cases. Yes, sir.
Relative to this young lady's first question, a few weeks ago, friends that I know went to the AG's office to try to get some evidence of violations of Public Records Act and privacy violations investigated by the AG's office. The AG's office said, that's not our business. Our business is to defend state agencies against lawsuits charging them with corruption. It's the IG's business to investigate fraud by in-state agencies. So I went with these people to your office, and a lady reluctantly came down and looked at the evidence, and she said, well, we don't investigate those kinds of corruption. We just investigate other things. We're not interested in privacy or the Public Records Act. And so the question is, why the cherry picking about the kind of fraud that you will or will not investigate? And secondly, this is a letter from the Department of Health and Human Resources, March 18, 2011, 1 September 12, 2014, that your office received. And DHH also asked you...
Sir, I have about 4 minutes. I would appreciate it if you get to your question.
Why did you never answer these?
Well, with regard to specific questions, sir, on cases, I'm not in a position to answer those today. I will tell you that with regard to the public records request, I'd like to answer, sir. I'd like to answer.
It's not a gotcha situation.
With regard to the public records request, there is a civil process that is set up for people to enforce the public records law, and it's not the Inspector General's job to do that. With regard to, we make individual decisions based on facts and cases. And I have a question back here, ma'am. You raised your hand a while ago. Do you still have?
Sure. My question is this. You're obviously having to defend the current budget and status that you have. My question for you would be, if you could present to this legislature, to this governor, what would benefit and make your office more efficient? Would it be an increase in staff? Would it be a particular change in the structure that you have? Is there anything that would improve this office, maybe to make it on par with others in the nation? Can you give that comparison?
Yeah, yes, the question was, what can we do to get the legislature to improve our situation, make the office more efficient? Well, of course, more staff would help, but the problem is without a protected funding stream, we're going to deal with these sorts of attacks, and it makes it difficult to get people into the office that have the skill set necessary. One of the guys that just left me was a veteran retired Secret Service agent, a guy who had investigated, these exact kind of cases his whole career. And boy, losing guys like that, it just hurts. It's very difficult. So protected funding would be the number one question that I would have for that. Yes, sir, in the back.
One more question. In your experience, are the criminal minds in this state average, above average?
Well, I think that there are some that are not very bright bulbs, and I think there are some that are quite sophisticated. And I think that, we do our best to try to stay one step ahead. But You know, our job, and I think it's pretty obvious, you know, pretty much every place that I go as the Inspector General publicly like this, one of the things that I've learned, I've always tried to do the job and let the job speak for itself and not go chasing cameras down the street. That's not the way we've ever done business. We try to let the professional work product speak for itself. I have now learned that I can no longer get away with that in this world. I've got to do more to educate the public about what we're doing. And I think every public stop that I've made, you've had people, I call them the peanut gallery, folks that have been on the wrong end of Inspector General investigations or who are otherwise have some sort of act. And you know, my job is we create axe grinders. That's what we do for a living. And so you're going to have folks show up and say, they're angry with the IG. That just made my case for me in a way that was more powerful than anything that I could ever say. And I will say this, some of those folks were actually in the room for the vote on our defunding. You might ask how they knew that it was going to happen when many people on the committee didn't. So with that, I want to thank you guys for having me. I'm glad that's done.